stuff like that. This talk will also hopefully be helpful for those of you who have other products that do fall under the on-farm home processing license purview of Maryland Department of Health. And this talk was a collaboration between myself, Maryland Department of Agriculture, and colleagues at the University of Maryland Eastern Shore, who I'll introduce in the talk, who have some really great resources for those of you guys who are looking to get into dried herb production. So this is the network that I am a part of. You see, we got our colleagues at College Park here. We have MDA, and then we also have our newest colleague to the team, Dr. Merlinda Schwartz. She is very interested in dried herb production, and she's got a lab working on water activity that I'll talk about a little bit later. But she's a go-to gal for you guys who are interested in learning more about this and getting your products licensed. Okay, so today we're going to talk about herbs. And first, to set the scene, it's important to consider why we care about herbs in food safety. And that's because drying is a really good way to lower food safety risks, but herbs and spices have been implicated in a few foodborne outbreaks since 1999. You can see that they've been responsible for 814 illnesses and 1 death. And then I also have listed here the food safety organisms of interest, the foodborne pathogens that are usually associated with issues in dried herb products. So you can see here from this table, this is a table that looks at the prevalence of salmonella that FDA found in dried herb products. And the prevalence is quite low in US products. But if you look at the same prevalence of imported herb products, you can see the prevalence of salmonella is a little bit higher. And that just signals to me that it's clear that food safety controls and a program in place is super important to make sure that the product that you're giving consumers is safe and super high quality. So how do we reduce food safety risks with dried herb products? It kind of comes down to 3 different things, and 2 of those things you guys as producers have the greatest control over. So first, it's our starting material. How do we make sure what goes into the process is, you know, a high quality and safe? And that's where good agricultural practices really come into play. We're not going to get into these a lot today, just a teeny weeny bit. Secondly, your process definitely will lower the risk of your ultimate product, because following a validated drying process and making sure that your sanitation program is really good will discourage the growth of unwanted microbes in your final product. And then finally, we have consumer handling. How consumers handle the product is by and large out of our hands, right? But at the end of the talk, I'll give a little bit of information about what you can put on your label to strongly suggest the best way and the safest way to prepare your product to result in a very low risk product. So altogether, you can see this is sort of a hurdle approach where each activity you do, the sum of those results in a low risk, high quality product. And that is our target goal. So in terms of good agricultural practices, we can group all of the inputs and activities in your operation into major farm elements here. You know we got humans on the farm. You might be using soil amendments to produce your fresh herb product. There might be animals on your farm. You might have to deal with the water quality on your farm. So keeping all of these things in mind and devising practices that are known to be lower risk practices will help you start out with fresh herbs that are high quality, so you don't have to mitigate problems with the processing step, right? So we have a whole course on how to get to this point. So if you have an interest in learning about basic good agricultural practices, feel free to contact me or Carol after the talk, and we can direct you to that course. In terms of your process, it's important to figure out first who is going to be regulating you in Maryland. And the 2 questions that I think are the easiest way to get to that answer is, so you want to figure out, number 1, what's the final product that I'm trying to sell? And 2, what's my manner of sales for that produce or value-added produce product, okay? So here's a table of different products in Maryland and what governing agency oversees them. You see that mostly fruits and vegetables are overseen by MDA. If you are making value-added products, if it's a cottage, if it falls under the cottage food law, like if it's a high acid jelly or jam, it could be a cottage food, right? So that's under the purview of MDH, but you wouldn't need a license for it. And then we have two other things over here, and I want to direct your attention to herbs. Herbs are an interesting case study because the growing of the herbs is covered under the federal produce safety rule under FSMA, but when you process it, MDH then gets involved. Maryland Department of Health then gets involved because the drying of that herb to Maryland Department of Health is considered a process, and that means that a license is required for it. So just keep in mind, if you're drying herbs, they are not going to fall under the cottage food law. All right, so in the value-added division of Maryland Department of Health, MDH, there are two licensing options that you can pursue as an herb grower, as a dried herb grower for teas or otherwise. So there's those folks who are grossing under $40,000 a year. Those folks would be targeting an on-farm home processing license, and the basic requirements for that is making sure that your process has potable water, either through hookup in the city or through a well that's been tested for potability. You have an approved sewage disposal system, and you go through a limited plan review. If you're grossing over $40,000, and this pertains specifically to the total sales of products that you're getting the processing license for, so this is about all of your dried herbs, right? So if you're growing over $40,000 of dried herbs, then you'll have to kick it up a notch to a full-fledged processing license. So the most of the talk, I'm going to focus on the targets that you'll need to hit for on-farm home processing license. And then as you get bigger, you can think about how you're going to change your space or who you're going to contract out to that has that commercial kitchen. Okay, so I mentioned that, you know, for on-farm home processing license folks, they're going to have a plan review by MDH. So now we're going to talk about what goes into that plan review. What are the things you're going to have to gather, your team will have to come up with for this plan review. So here are the basic building blocks of a plan review. You submit a document that explains what your site details are. You submit a document that has your standard operating procedures for activities that are of interest to MDH. You talk about your sanitation program. You talk about what your control is and your verification. So this is the drying step. And you have a product list and a copy of your label. At this point for the on-farm home processing license, recall plans are not required, but we've seen the writing on the wall as food safety educators. It is likely in the next 5 years, this is going to be required for more and more folks creating different, raw agricultural commodities and value-added products. So it's a good idea now to think about and get familiar with lot codes. And I'll talk about that right at the end. It's important before we go any further to make sure that whatever I say today is these are good recommendations, but it's definitely not one size fits all. MDH goes through each specific person's plan with them, and your product might require additional or separate specifications based on what product you're making. All right, so I know, in some terms, people who are doing dried flowers for teas, you might have to comply with some additional requirements, or you might be exempt from some requirements. So this is just why it's really important that whatever you're trying to make that's a dried product, contact MDH right when you get started. And we have herb consultant experts at University of Maryland Eastern Shore. Her name is Henriette Den Oden, and I have her contact information at the end there. It's really important to get up with these people when you're starting in the formulation stage so you know exactly what you need to do. Okay, but in general, the start is going to look a little like this. So you're going to get with your team, you're going to make a list of what you intend to make, your intended products list. You'll make a list of your equipment, what kind of sink you have, what's your dehydrator look like, what's your storage facility look like, what sort of packaging materials you're going to make. And then you're going to want to prep a description of the process flow, how things flow from their harvest all the way to their drying. And what I would recommend is start with a draft, and then you contact MDH, talk about that draft, and they'll give you some, flags. They'll say like, okay, we're going to have some we're going to want to drill down into this particular facet a little bit more, right? And then also when you contact MDH, this is the time where you want to contact those herb consultants as well, just to make sure that, you know, they think that the process is going to work for the on-farm home processing license. So once you get pretty good with your process, or as you're kind of doing that, you want to make sure that the water that you're using in the processing side of everything is potable. So that either means getting city water or having your well tested for total coliforms, turbidity, and nitrates. And we have a suite of labs. This is an MDA, Maryland Department of Agriculture, screen grab of the water testing labs that are available in Maryland. There are a few more than are on this list, but there are some good options around Baltimore, and we very much recommend, you know, taking a look at this ArcGIS map to help you navigate through water potability tests. Okay. So in general, when MDH comes to your facility, these are the general requirements that they're going to look for to ensure that your processing space is suitable for making a dried herb product. And what I'm going to say here is very similar to what we look for in produce packing areas as well. So you want to make sure you have good ventilation through the space. You want to make sure that this one might be a little bit different compared to produce packing houses, but they like to see that floor, walls, and ceilings are smooth and cleanable. That's very vague, so this is something that you're going to want to ask them about if you're dealing, if you're folks that have like a dirt floor, you're going to want to ask MDH how they feel about that before you go further. You want to make sure that there is access to a hand wash sink, that the light bulbs over the working area are shatterproof, or there are shields on them so that glass that shatters does not get into product. There should be an accessible toilet. The waste disposal and sewage disposal system should be up to code. And then finally, you should have the ability to wash, rinse, and sanitize equipment and utensils that are used for the process. And similarly to the building specs, we want to make sure that our dehydrator is made of, you know, hard, cleanable surfaces. They're not porous because hard surfaces are a little bit easier to clean and sanitize. Okay, so you're going to want to provide Maryland Department of Health a detailed description of your planned food process. So how you are harvesting, how you're staging, how you're washing things, and how you're drying, and then weighing and packing and all that stuff. So a process flow diagram really helps in getting your mind around and organizing what specific things you need details for. So I've kind of come up with a really basic one here. You might have other activities that are not listed here. That's okay, just add them in. The most important thing is that you want this process flow, if possible, to flow in one direction from harvest to the finished product. We want to set up our processing in such a ways where we're not going backwards any steps, because if we go backwards, then we have the ability to mix or cross-contaminate stuff that's already been dried, already went through the kill step, back to things that have not gone through the kill step yet. So there's the ability for finished products to mix with raw, and we definitely don't want that in terms of the product itself and the packaging. So one way that a unidirectional flow can look like is like this, right? So this is a one-way flow where we see things are kind of staged in different places in the pack house, but you see no one goes, we're not going backwards, everything is moving in one direction. First from staging to washing, then we come over here to drying and so forth. But you might have a space where things look different, right? So for example, if we switch these two things right here, we created two potential issues that we have to take a look at. Number one, we have the packaging materials that are supposed to just be interacting with clean final product. We have that right next to staging our fresh product. And so that can create an issue. So what we recommend here is, if you can't move where this is, can you cover it in such a way so that it minimizes anything that's being staged over here from interacting with your packaging materials. And then we also have washing over here, and washing over here could be an issue because, as you see, we're going backwards. We're not necessarily going in one direction. So this might be the setup that you have. And fear not, because there are things that you can do. If your processing isn't set up in one direction as it is, you can use time, you can use physical barriers, and you can use activities to create that separation. So if you have this situation in your processing house, what I would recommend is maybe you set something up where you only weigh and pack in the morning, and then you wash in the afternoons. And after you're finished washing, you clean and sanitize the weighing and packing area so it's ready and clean for the next morning. So that's one way to get around that. Okay. So now on to our standard operating procedures. So Maryland Department of Health wants to see that your activities that you do to make the product have accounted for all the potential hazards, and you're following procedures that are well written so that anybody coming onto the property can execute that in a standard uniform way that reduces risk. So here are a list of sample SOPs that you'll want to write with your team about how things go on in your process: harvest, washing, dehydrating, packing, storage, distribution, and sanitation, okay? And then for each of these, you'll want to detail exactly what the activity is, who it applies to, what your expectation is for getting that activity done, what you need to do to execute, and all the materials that you would possibly need for that activity. So it's a very detailed document, and we're going to go through, we'll spend a little bit of time on each of the things highlighted in green, just some simple considerations for you to think about as you're preparing these for MDH to review. And the first one we'll talk about is harvest your fresh product. Okay, so for the harvest SOP. So harvest is important because good directions here will help minimize issues from coming in to the processing area. It's going to help minimize, excess dirt from coming in there. Good direction for your employees is going to help minimize any fresh product with potential contamination from going into the pack house. So it's really important. So make sure you train your workers to be able to spot if herbs have poop or other visible contamination on them, and workers should know not to harvest those, to do a little bit of a buffer when they're harvesting. So if you see poop on one herb, maybe you don't harvest the herbs that are directly next to the pooped on herb as well as the pooped on herb, right? Because we don't want to introduce any issues into our packing area and our processing area. Ideally, harvest bins and utensils should be cleaned and sanitized before going out to the field. So we're starting clean and we're keeping clean as much as possible as we move through our harvest. After you harvested your herbs, minimize the herb contact with the ground. This is just because we don't want excess dirt from coming in, right? The less dirt that comes in, the less we have to worry about it messing with our wash step, things like that. So that's important for the harvest SOP. So for the herb washing SOP, so Maryland Department of Health does require herbs to be washed before dehydrating, and you could do this in a few different ways. I do know there has been chatter that some flour producers might look a little different to them. So this is another step where it's important to really communicate with MDH based on what your product is to see if your requirements are any different. But in general, all right, there are two ways that you can wash your product. You can either use a hose or some other single pass water situation. This is where maybe you have herbs in a colander in the sink and you have the sink faucet going onto the herbs in a colander. So that is single pass water, and that's completely fine to use. You do not need a sanitizer with that water use. You might also, if you're a little bit bigger, you might be using like a 3-compartment sink situation where you put batches of herbs into a sink full of water and then it goes into 2 other sinks. So that is considered recirculated waters because we have the same water that is touching many, many batches of herbs. And in that water use, we highly, highly recommend you use a sanitizer. And the sanitizer's job is to sanitize the water to cut down on any potential cross-contamination. So without sanitizer in the water in a 3-compartment sink situation, if you have a contaminant coming in on one batch of herbs and you put that in the sink of water, and then you take that batch out, all subsequent batches of herbs going in have the potential then to be contaminated because water is such a good method of transfer of foodborne pathogens. So if you're using recirculated water, it's important to use a sanitizer. There are many options that you can use that are approved for use in washing fresh fruits and vegetables, and there are organic options as well. And you can go to this site, which I have at the end, that will help you navigate through what to pick. Okay. All right, now to the drying SOP. The drying SOP. This is one of the main controls for your product safety, dried herbs and checking the water activity. You do have some flexibility in this process. Again, this is another step. This definitely is a step where you work closely with herb consultants and MDH to make sure that everything that you're doing, they'll accept, and it works to make a high quality product on your end. All right. So the drying equipment will be thoroughly reviewed by MDH. They heavily favor the use of commercial dryers like a table dehydrator. And you might run into issues, you likely will run into issues if you have a solar dryer. So just letting you know right now, this is another reason why it's important to be engaged in talks with MDH about this. Your drying process needs to be at a controlled temperature for a set amount of time to achieve a water quality, a water activity of less than 0.85. This is the required criteria, the required quality verification criteria that MDH is going to look for to check off that your drying process is sufficient enough to control the growth of microbes. Okay, so your drying temperature is another thing that is variable depending on what product you have. I do know that MDH has stated they prefer 135 degrees Fahrenheit, but again, this is not one size fits all. You might find that 135 is not appropriate for your herbs. So this is really important, another really important reason to talk with MDH about this. But regardless of the time and temperature requirements that you come up with to get your the water activity that you need, I really recommend that you have a monitor or a log for this where you can record the time in for your batch, the time out for your batch, and the temperature to make sure that your process is hitting the control point that you set up for it, that it has gone for the amount of time it needs to go for at the temperature, and the temperature was appropriate through the duration of that process. Okay, so a little bit more on water activity and why it's needed for an on-farm home processing license for dried herbs. So water activity is the amount of unbound water in a food product. It is water that's not bound to any ingredients, and it is, because it's free water, it's allowed to be used by microbes to grow and proliferate. So we want to reduce the water activity so we reduce microbial growth. You can see over here as an example, the water activity of pure water is 1 because all of that is free water able to be used by microbes, right? And then conversely, the water activity of a really dry product like granola bars is 0.21. So that's really low. There's not a lot of microbial growth going on in granola bars. So MDH wants you to hit 0.85 because at that water activity and lower, microbial growth is really reduced. And the microbial growth of many pathogens is really reduced at water activities of 0.85 and below. So functionally for you guys, you might find that to get your high quality herbs, your water activity might be in the 0.6 range, and that's completely fine. It can be lower than 0.85, but it has to at least be 0.85 or lower, okay? So for every product that you have, you only need to get 1 water activity test, unless you change the drying procedure or you change other parts of your recipe. That's where our colleagues at UMES come in. So if you're in the formulation stage, we highly recommend to kind of tinker with things with Dr. Melinda Schwartz. She's also on this call, and this is her contact info. And then when you're ready to submit your regulatory sample, you can contact Microbac. They have a really wonderful staff in Baltimore, and they will send your samples to Warrendale, PA. So you can contact them here, and I have them at the end of the slides as well. Okay, So on to sanitation. Sanitation is equally important in your drying process because germs are known to lurk and grow in dirty areas. Your sanitation SOPs are going to cover more than just cleaning and sanitizing. It's going to cover your pest control, employee health and hygiene, and labeling of stored chemicals. For cleaning and sanitizing, just remember that these couple things have to be included. What's being cleaned, how you're cleaning and sanitizing, how often, and that's something that's up to you, and where things are stored, and how you're recording it down. So this encompasses everything, you know, reusable gloves, tools, bathrooms, and your equipment. I just caution everyone to remember for cleaning and sanitizing, cleaning always comes before sanitizing. Even if you have a super concentrated sanitizer, if you're spraying that down on a dirty surface, you are not doing any cleaning. You're just wasting your money. So make sure that you clean before you sanitize. And cleaning can be done with dry brushing and then soap. Then you rinse it and then apply your sanitizer. There are also organic options for this type of sanitizer for food contact surfaces. So again, you can use that, the Produce Safety Alliance Excel tool that I included in a couple slides ago to help you figure out what sanitizers might work for you. Okay, packaging. In terms of packaging, there are some key things that have to be on your package: the product identity, name of farm and address, the quantity, ingredients, and instructions. It can look something like this. What I have heard is that it's important to include a contact number, and it's also important to include instructions to prepare the product safely. So for example, here with mint tea, your instructions can be boil water to 212 degrees Fahrenheit, and then add, you know, X amount of tea to your teacup and steep for 5 minutes, right? So that's super important too. Do not make any medicinal claims on your label, because that will just be an extra headache. I don't think you're allowed to put medicinal claims on an on-farm home processing product. Okay, the last piece of the puzzle here is traceability. It's important to get familiar with this now. This is a good business practice, and I think in a couple of years, this might be required for all food producers. So food traceability allows you, the farmer, to know how much product you've sold to customers, and it can also help you track your activities and inputs. Being able to trace a specific batch of product is important for food safety and quality, because if a customer ever has a problem, you can track exactly what amount of product is associated with that specific problem, and it can create fewer headaches for you when you're trying to do root cause analysis. So integral to traceability is creating a lot number that is a unique identifier for a set amount of product that you have. A basic lot number includes the code of what your product is, and you could do this with numbers or letters, and the dry date for you dried herb producers. You can also attach this to your harvest date and your sale date, okay? So a sample code could look like this. This is basil, the product code. This is a Julian date of the dry date, so 1 to 365, so you don't have to mess with a bunch of other numbers. And you can also add the year. And this is functionally how you could use lot numbers. It's a specific batch of dried basil product that was sold to, you know, this specific customer and had these units. So this is really important for those people who are, as you're growing up, you are going to need to have a lot number. And if you have any questions about that, we are more than happy to walk you through how to set up a lot, how to do traceability, and, you know, other things that you would need to be recall ready. All right, so in summary, food safety is important for dried herb quality and safety. It's super important to just remember that these are all recommendations and it's not one size fits all. So hopefully you feel a little bit more confident about the different things that you'll need. But getting in touch with those experts early and calling often is really, really going to be important. And having a really strong team that can noodle things around, devise a process flow, and make SOPs and SSOPs, that's going to be really important. So here's a selected references list, and I gave the PDF versions of the slides to Nia, and you guys can go through these if you have questions or want to read more about it. And with that, I will take any questions you have. Here are the contact infos again for if you want to chat with the MDH Office of Facility and Process Review, if you want to chat with herb consultant experts at UMES, or if you want help on water activity measurements. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. That was wonderful. That was a lot of really useful information condensed into a small time. I appreciate you doing that in 30 minutes. I know our internet attention spans are very short, so that was awesome. I put the slides in the chat and I'll be emailing them out later this week as well. We have one question already, and would you please put other questions that you have into the chat box? Hannah asks, can you describe the water activity tests more? Is it looking at the amount of moisture that's left in the herbs after drying?
Great, thank you so much for that question. So that sounds like getting the water content. So water content is kind of related but different than water activity. So water activity is specifically looking at the amount of free water in a sample of product. So for example, like jams. Jams are a pretty wet product, so the moisture content will be kind of high, but the free water that's available for microbes to use is low. It's at, like, as I think I put in that chart, jams could be around 0.84 or lower water activity. So does that make sense? It's free water.
Is that because the water in the jam is kind of bound up by the sugar in the jam as well?
Exactly. Yes. Yep.
Very cool. Thank you. There's another question by Anthony. Are distinctions made between herbs for spices and teas and herbs for medicinal purposes in terms of drying and processing?
For food safety, for your food safety process, it's going to be pretty similar. The differences might be, you know, if you want to use different equipment, and that's going to be something that you'll have to run through MDH. For quality wise, I am pretty certain that for quality wise, you'll go through the processes for drying might be a little bit different. Maybe Melinda, if you're on the call, do you know of anything specific with medicinal teas or teas versus dried herbs in terms of, like, for quality, their water activities and dry times?
No, I'm thinking that the spices would maybe require a longer dry time than the herbs, but I don't think, yeah, no, otherwise.
Yeah. So for quality, it's likely you will end up with a different process, but the basic building blocks for food safety are similar.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Angela, and thank you for joining us, Melinda. It's good to meet you. Are there any other questions? Oh, there's one. Are there GAP standards specifically for urban agriculture? Farmer Chippy asks.
For dried herbs or for fresh herb products?
Dry herbs.
So the GAPs, you won't be able to get that product GAP certified. You could get the growing aspect of it, like that could fall under the purview of doing good agricultural practices. And if you're selling fresh herbs, then we have those GAP standards. But for dry, that's where we level up to then, okay, now we're under the purview of MDH. We have to follow those processing requirements. So specific GAP standards for herbs, other than kind of what I had mentioned in terms of like harvesting, that's what I would probably recommend, is just in making sure we're starting as good as we can start, so we're not bringing any issues into the processing area.
Thank you. And I just wanted to repeat to clarify for anyone who's wondering, GAPS, what we're talking about, the good agricultural practices, that's a voluntary certification for any essentially fresh fruits or vegetables where you harvest it and you sell it and you don't do any other processing. You don't cut it up, you don't dry it. As soon as you start cutting it up and drying it, then it becomes a value-added product. And like Angela said, there's different and additional requirements at that stage.